So here's the Karcey miler manual, and some people ask me about this thing. It's old. 1980 was 44 years ago, and you learn things through the years. But this is a Karman gear, 54 miles an hour. 54 miles per gallon in a gear at 55 miles an hour. It might be possible. There's no way you can get that in a bug. The aerodynamics of a bug are just terrible. So don't think that because you're not getting good mileage and you can't get to this, that you've done something wrong. This is, in modern day environment and what we do, it's just not going to be possible. Kind of get that out of your head, but there is some interesting stuff here. Let me see if I can work my way through it now. Just a couple opening pages, nothing there. Picture of the engine. Unfortunately, this is rather dark, so you can't really see too much about what he's got rigged up and how things are kind of oriented and whatnot. But if you want to go farther, cheaper, who doesn't? Going to talk about moving the RPM range. This is going to involve changing the gear ratios. We're going to take it, we're going to downsize it. Camshaft redesigned. The camshaft that he talks about in here is not the camshaft that I ultimately bought from him. So he modified the camshaft through the years. But that one, no, he stopped doing that. Modified it a little bit. Okay, down in this section right here, he's talking about water injection. Let me go ahead and read some of this. One unique item employed is the use of a water injector. This permits running the engine under a lean condition. Volkswagens are not notorious for running under a lean condition. They would rather have the richer jet settings, as the extra fuel helps keep the engine cool. In this case, we are using water instead of the extra fuel. Please bear in mind that the engine does have to be run on premium fuel. This is in fact called soil, otherwise known as leaded gasoline, which we don't do anymore. And no, you don't have to run it on premium fuel. Unleaded with an octane booster. Let's go. All right, let me talk about this real quick, because there are some things that, if I was not knowledgeable, I would read this and think that water is some kind of a miracle device that is somehow or another going to magically provide me with the ability to get huge miles. And it doesn't. So let's go through that real quick here. Okay, first of all, we're talking about stoichiometric, or stoke for short, which means, okay, the chemical equation is balanced as far as the burning of fuel in air. That ratio is about 14.7 to 1. Now, back in the day when the white-haired old farts were coming up with all these rules, you know, they weren't white-haired old farts at the time, but they were establishing themselves as the grand and glorious, and now they become the white-haired old farts. Anyway, what they established was that they like to run over here. It's about stoke minus 1.2, and they like to be over here. All he's saying over here in this book, all he's saying, even though he's not saying it specifically, is that you want to be about that plus 1.2 or over here on this side. And I've already gone through and told you in one of my cooling videos that this is what the fuel injecting guys are telling you. You need to be right there, not over here and not right there. And your car will run coolest and produce its best mileage at this point. So all he's telling you is that that's where you need to be, and you don't need water to run here. In other words, this permits running the engine under lean condition. Absolutely not. You can run lean without the water. It's not necessary. I would recommend that you not do a water injector. There are problems with it. If you insist on doing it, you'll find out. How to use the manual. He's got a bunch of suppliers. Some of these are out there, some are not. Your suppliers are your suppliers. Parts ordering, whatever. We all know that CB Performance charges an arm and a leg to ship stuff to you, so. Anyway, individual pieces, crankshaft. He wants you to use a stroker. You could do that. Like I said, I don't actually think that it's necessary. I do like counterweights. Here's what he says. Counterweighted crankshafts start producing their power from 2,000 RPMs on up. That's mechanic speak. You know, in order to produce power, you have to put fuel and air into the engine. A crankshaft does not put fuel and air into the engine. It doesn't determine the efficiency of the engine. What counterweights do is they alter the vibration characteristics. The vibration characteristics and the power that they utilize and suck away from everything else becomes more problematic. as the RPMs go up. So it makes sense that as the RPMs go up, you can reduce the power sucking draw of vibration. They don't produce power, they reduce parasitic drags. So he's got that wrong. Some prices and whatnot. Connecting rods. Just, you're playing all basic stock stuff, balanced and clearance. I'd say even if you've got a 69 stroke, still buy the clearance rods because they're lighter. They're going to cause the engine to vibrate less. Parasitic drag. Engine case, any kind of a single or dual relief, even the aluminum ones, but do not use the ancient stuff from the early 1200 cc's. Nothing before 1966. Just wouldn't go down that far. The oil pump, just your basic stocker. The oil cooler, he recommends an external oil cooler. He may have been kind of... I think if you look at the pictures, he was using an earlier style fan shroud that had the internal. So he wanted to get rid of the internal, but if you get rid of the internal and you don't go to a doghouse, there's nothing left except what he's got right there. I don't really care. Do whatever you want. It's not going to make a big difference. Doghouses are fine. My system's fine. What he talks about right here is fine for an engine that's not putting out a lot of power. This is fine. Pistons and cylinders. Again, he's going to talk about doing 77s. I seriously don't go down to 77s. That's counterproductive. I've got my reasons for running, as we'll get to a different cylinder head. So let's move. Cylinder heads. Also from a 1966 1300 series. That means it's going to be a single port. And I've got a whole bunch of reasons why I don't like single ports. They are really problematic when you try and bolt dual single barrels to them. They have a tough time sealing. And two, you absolutely cannot upgrade single barrels if they got a single port. You can't stick, I don't know, like an MPH-PMX. A nice set of small HPMX, which are really nice carburetors. You can't put them on top of a single port. So there's no upgradability. And, people tell you, oh, those single ports make great torque. It's not about torque. It's about making the right amount of power to go down the road. And whether you got single or dual ports, it doesn't matter. You will produce enough torque to go down the road. So this argument of single ports being great, it just doesn't work in this paradigm. Here's where he talks about a camshaft, webcam, grind 101. Like I say, this is obsolete. The camshafts that I bought were from Crane Cam. 109-degree lobe centers. I know that the lobe centers were even further apart by the time I got my cams. I believe they were 110-degree lobe centers. So he kept pushing them further and further apart. Other than that, they had relatively short durations. And again, this is a 1980s camshaft. You can do better than this stuff right here if you really know what you're doing. And it's like, yeah, there is some good stuff with the camshafts, but you can make mileage with a lot of cams. Push rod, valve spring retainers. We're going to be modifying, because he's stretching the engine out by putting a bigger crank in, you need longer rods. You need longer push rods. So right here he's talking about push rods and valve spring retainers. These are both of the aluminum variety. And I don't believe nowadays that you can get aluminum spring retainers, but you can get titanium spring retainers. In addition to this, you can also, if you go into the performance bicycling world, these guys use titanium nuts all over their bikes. So you can replace the little retaining nut that holds your screw in place with a titanium nut. So that gives you titanium retainers and titanium nuts. Push rods are made so that you can adjust the length, blah, blah, whatever. Use aluminum and not chromoly. Heavy-duty rocker shafts, that's the bolt end type. Yeah, those are really nice. Captive pad adjusting screws are also a must as they eliminate valve bind. This is a major piece of mechanic speak right there. So he's trying to convince you to use these captive pads. And, that other grand and glorious guy was also trying to convince you that they're a miracle device. They're not a miracle device. They will not eliminate valve bind. They won't reduce friction. They just, maybe to some extent, improve maintenance. But worthless as far as making mileage. It doesn't really matter. Okay, as far as valve bind goes, when you press the valve down, you've got a certain amount of gap between the coils of the spring. So if you push too far, eventually the gap between all the coils of the spring eliminates and the coil binds up. So putting a captive pad does not stop this from happening. Additionally, on the inside, you've got the base of the keepers and the retainer, and if you push down too far, and even if your coil doesn't bind, if you push down too far, the bottom of that assembly will then push against the guide, and again you've got an issue, a situation where you've got bind, and neither one of these binding situations are impacted by that device. Carburation, cadrons. I think cadrons are too big. The bore's 40 millimeter, it's too big for an engine this small. You can modify them. Here's some stuff on Venturis. Smaller Venturis obviously are better than big Venturis because you're trying to push the point at which you go onto the main circuit lower. There are people who are going to tell you that you want to be running on like your progression ports or your idle jet. No, you want to be running on your main. The idles and the progression ports do not atomize the fuel properly. Your mileage is going to suffer as a result. So smaller carbs, smaller Venturis take you where you need to be. The ignition system, there's a lot of stuff. So long as you're in the ballpark, the only way to really do it is use a modern system that's got a programmable map. I've got like RPMs. I've got on the other side, I've got my vacuum. Here's my vacuum, here's my RPMs, here's an advanced table. We've all seen these. Hopefully you've all seen what those things are. And you just program it out. So ultimately, the mechanical stuff isn't going to lead you in the direction you want to go. So that guy right there, he's also got some kind of a capacitive discharge. CDs aren't really going to benefit you unless you increase your spark plug gap. And he'll talk about that in here, and he didn't do anything with his gaps, so the CD unit doesn't really help that much. Exhaust system, just some kind of a merge system. That's fine, but he does tell you to get rid of the stock system. Flywheel and damper. All right, like the Berg, the Berg one that I've got, the big heavy chunk of steel, that's all you need. He's got something that he took off of a 6-cylinder Jaguar. At one point in time, I had purchased one of these, and yeah, it's kind of a waste of time, waste of money. Don't do it. The 180 millimeter clutch assembly. I do run the 180 millimeter clutch assembly. It is really nice and smooths things out. Flywheel must be drilled for the 8-dowel crankshaft when you're going to strokers or counterweighted aftermarkets on a 69 stroke. So this is true. Water injector, I already told you, don't bother. Transmissions, yes, you must reduce the RPMs. You flat out cannot keep it where it is if you want to get mileage. Go to Volkswagen dealer, purchase surface manual. We know we can't do that anymore. Assembly, and all the assembly stuff is basically just your standard assembly type stuff. 180 millimeter flywheel. There's the big pulley that he's talking about. You can see that this thing's got counterweights and whatnot. Nothing special there. Here's some clearancing. We all know if you've ever done a stroker that you clearance there, you clearance there, you clearance here. Here, there's a little bit of backing that you got to do off in this area. If you go with a really huge stroke, sometimes you have to get into clearancing a little piece of the cam tunnel type stuff. Some stuff on pistons. Notice that he talks about notching your pistons. A lot of you guys, I'm sure you've seen it, where somebody goes out, well, I'm putting a stroker in, let me just chop the entire thing off. Do not chop the entire thing off. There's a reason why that is stuck out there. One of these days I might do a video on it. Assembling the case. In his particular instance, he went with a 76 stroke, so he's put in a whole bunch of these spacers. Nowadays you don't really have to do this. Like I say, if you're doing a 69 by 83, you wouldn't do this at all. But if you do want to do a stroker, you can go with B pistons and slightly longer rods. There's a lot of ways you can do this and not have to do the spacers. And I would recommend finding a way to do it without the spacers first. In my particular engine, I've got a very tiny spacer because I did some stuff with the pistons in order to make it clear. Yeah, it cost me a couple of bucks. It's more expensive to do what I did than to do this, but it's a better way of doing it. Assembling of the case, it's all pretty standard. All right, you see this sump? Don't run a sump. These things are rather ineffective for most of us. They don't do any cooling of the oil, and I've already told you that the oil doesn't carry much of the heat load. So that doesn't really matter. Tins, he does run these super cool tins, the Type 3 tins. So he does tell you to get rid of the standard Type 1 stuff and run these. And I do run those on my car. Coming over to here, he tells you not to hog this out. This is your exhaust port. But he does tell you to clearance the metal that is around the guide. And then he's got a few items in here about stuff that's very specific to this particular type of head, but I would suggest that you not run that head, so I don't want to do much with it. Valve train. Just degreeing the, we're going to take it, put it in, and we want to degree the cam just to make sure the cam is set up the way you want it to be done. Push rods out. Stock valve springs. That's pretty much what my channel is all about. What can you get away with on a stock valve spring? No heavy duties for me. It doesn't mean I can't talk about it, but I don't like to. I don't really like to go down that road. Too many RPMs. Keep the valve stems from getting. To keep the valve stem from getting chewed up, I install swivel feet. Doesn't matter. Works just fine. With stock stuff, doesn't matter. You can even use the high ratios that don't even have an adjuster at that end, and they work just fine. Not going to tear up. Oh, if you do use the high ratios that don't have some kind of an adjuster at this end, it's probably advisable to do lash caps. Otherwise, you're probably going to tear something up. And it's probably going to be your rocker arm and not the valve stem. The hardened valve stem. Pretty tough. It's going to eat into your rocker arm. Spacings, valve springs. He's talking about aluminum retainers, and I don't think you can do aluminum retainers anymore. These are titanium. I do have titaniums on mine. Rotating, clearancing, make sure everything's done. This is just a bunch of assembly stuff. It's all pretty standard. All right, right here we got the Solex type stuff, which is, what do we call those guys? Cadrons. You can see that crossbar, it's a cadron. Anyway, you change the venturis of the cadrons. The throttle plate is too big. 40 millimeters is just too big. And as a result of that, all the venturis are like designed for big. But this is a small engine and you want it to, like I say, handle lower RPMs. Small venturi. He's got in here a, where is it? He lists right here the 36 millimeter Webers. I don't think it's 36. I think that's a typo. I think these are the actual, I think these are supposed to be 34 millimeter Webers. The dual single Webers. Let's see, what does Empey? Empey's got a replacement for it as well, so basically what I'm running as well, the 34 Baby Dells. So, yeah, basically a smaller carb. I suppose you could get away with, I wouldn't run 40s, like a 40 Delordo or a 40 Weber in a dual two-barrel setup, but I think that if you could get a 36 Delordo, that might work. These, like I say, these engines are pretty small. 40s, it's just too big a throttle plate. Anyway, oil cooler, he talks about doing that stuff. Check it out. He's got it right over the intake hole. But I've already mentioned this. The oil doesn't carry much heat. And if you warm it up off the oil, it doesn't get that much warmer, which means it still has plenty of heat carrying capacity to pass through. And again, this fan shroud is not doghouse. If he had a doghouse fan shroud, my guess is that he would have gotten rid of this and just stayed with the doghouse. It would have been just fine. Flywheel and clutch, he does talk about using the 180 millimeters. It's not going to bark your tires. Like, I can't really bark the tires on my 1745. There's enough power there to do it, but the diameter of this thing is just too small. That doesn't mean it slips. Like, once I've engaged and I got everything locked up, it doesn't break loose. But it's hard for it to catch and bark the tires. So if you want to bark your tires, go with a 200 millimeter. If you're not concerned, and I'm not concerned about it, 180 is the way to go. More rotating mass. It just damps out vibrations. It's smoother. Install the engine, the water injection port for turning it on and off. Some other tuning, fine tuning, break-in, oil, stuff like that. Nothing special over there. It's just an engine. By the time you've assembled it, it's just an engine. Spark plugs, like I said. 003 is your gap. That's way too small. 028 when using standard ignition. So he's got a CD ignition, but he's only going to 030. That's ridiculous. I mean, if you've got a CD unit, I'd be pushing that out to 050 easily. Carburetor jettings, Solexes, Venturi size, whatever. He ended up not doing this, and he started doing more stuff with the Webers by the time I got hold of his stuff. Distributor, again, it doesn't really matter, because no matter what you do from a distributor standpoint, it's going to be inferior to an electronically mapped ignition that you can put on there. So I don't want to mess with that too much. Water injection, I already told you, I don't think that this is really what you should be doing. You're not sacrificing too much. Engine oils, not getting into it. Whatever you want to do, it's not going to make a huge difference so long as the oil pump is proper for what you're doing. Too big an oil pump, you increase windage. Windage is going to create a parasitic drag. So 26 millimeters for one of these things is fine. 30 millimeters, no. Fuel. Premium or anything over 92 octane, doesn't really matter. I mean, it all depends on what your car is, how close to sea level you live, what your compression rate is. There's a lot of stuff that impacts this. But you don't necessarily need 92 octane. You just experiment a little bit. If you build it and it knocks, you run the octane up. If you build it like my car and it doesn't knock, you run the octane down. Valve settings, okay. Put hydraulics in. Put an oil filter on it and run hydraulics, and then you don't have to worry about that. The damper. Found something that'll work. The big heavy one that I've got from Berg is fine. Empey makes a variant that a lot of people don't seem to think is machined properly, but I don't know. But yeah, just a basic heavy hunk of steel is good. Again, it's vibration damping. That's what it does. Transaxle mods, 8/2/4. 388 ring and pinion, we all know about those. Slow the engine down, that's the way to do it. Gear lube, amps, oil, synthetic, whatever, just so long as it's something that's nice and isn't too heavy. Tires and wheels, now he's definitely a fan of thin. What is he running here? He's got a 155/15, so with an 80 series sidewall, it's pretty round tire. You know, I run a 185/65, so it's got a little bit less profile, it's a little bit fatter, but it's a modern tire. It'll go around a corner. It's trade-offs. I mean, if you really want to build a mileage thing, you need a skinnier tire, but I have no idea how much I'm sacrificing. Half a mile per gallon, it's not worth it to me. Rims, I run stock. Shock absorbers, just something that absorbs is fine. The Project. Advanced developments, supplements will be available. I know that at one point in time I got at least 2 or 3 supplements, but they're gone. So can't do anything there. And it looks like by the time he got out to doing this stuff, he was in Hawaii. And that's it. The Mylar manual. Let's see if I can augment this with a couple of things. Alright, so I have a few parts that are Karcey special. Ultimately, he got away from Cadrons and went with the Weber 34 ICT. Hopefully you can see that. And obviously I purchased this stuff. I purchased that and all of the jets and Venturis and whatnot that goes with it. These are from about 1983. Made in Italy. So, and they are rather crusty looking, but if I was to clean them up, they are rather pristine. There's very little wear, rust, corrosion. They are quite amazing. I could bolt them up and they would take off. They are right now jetted not for a 1415. In other words, a 77 by 76. They are jetted for a 1745. I was running 1745 when I went and I purchased the Dells, and when I got the Dells, the baby Dells, while I had things apart, I also downsized the motor, because by the time I got to this point, I had my 2-liter up and running on the 74. There was no need for me to have a 1745. I thought I'd go back to the 1415 and play with it a little tiny bit. But that's all he did. He just used, just plain old Italian Weber 34 ICTs. Anyway, let's look at the inside of this little tiny bit. I've taken the top of the carb off here, and nothing special down in there. I mean, you just pick out a main jet, you pick out an air corrector, which I took out because I wanted to get the Venturi out. Not the Venturi. I wanted to get that air. I wanted to get this emulsion tube out, and it's stuck in there pretty well. So I'd have to investigate a little tiny bit how to get that out. So I need to put this air corrector back in. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in the vid was that you do not want to run on your progression ports which are down in there somewhere. I believe on this carb they're on this side. I don't know if I've got enough light to show it, but they're on this end. But you want to be able to open the throttles enough to get the main circuit to fire up. In other words, that big round circle right in the middle, you want that round circle to fire off and start drawing fuel right down the middle. Putting fuel through the edge just doesn't do a good job of providing. It's like it's off to the edge. One, it doesn't atomize well, and it's not centered in the airflow, so it doesn't do a good job. Anyway, these things have this little funky piece right here. Maybe you're not familiar with it, but some of you have seen these. You're like, wait a minute, that doesn't belong. That doesn't look right. This is what's called a booster venturi. And when you got his kit from the place down in Texas, I forget what the name of the place was, you got this thing right here. Might have to pull it out with the pliers here a little bit. So anyway, it came with these little guys right here. Little booster venturi. It was pretty just a rough cut type thing. I have since then taken a Dremel to it and kind of smoothed out some of the rough edges and whatnot, and it had a tough time getting past the pump jet, so I had to put a little mark on that edge in order to get it down past the pump jet. But one of the things that you get this, remember now, he was putting this thing together for a tiny engine. This is not actually designed for engines that are 1400 cc's, so you put a small venturi in there and it gets you in the ballpark, but you need to make this hole even smaller to make sure that this comes online early. Like I say, you want to be on your main jet. So this, when plunked in there, reduces the cross-sectional area for the air to flow through, bringing the air velocity up and making the center main go on early. I mean, you don't necessarily need something like this when you're running a 1745 like I am, but yeah, it made a difference back when I was running a 1415 cc engine. I never did put anything like this on my Baby Dells, and the Baby Dells never did work as well as these did on that tiny engine. So anyway, pretty interesting little add-on right there. Let me show you something else while I got the camera going here. Alright, I did mention that he got away from webcam and he started using crane. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. It is really light. But right across here it says crane. And like I say, he stopped making webcam, his cam supplier, and he started using crane cam. Which means this is a genuine mid-1980s, circa 85, 86, 87 Karcey Monocam. This is the real deal. This is no fake. I'm not kidding you. I had 3 of these cams. 2 of them are installed in my engines, and I had a third one. I was going to put it in my spare engine that you've seen in some of my other videos, only I decided to up the RPM potential of that engine a little bit. I think that other engine's got like a, it's got like an angle 100 in it, maybe an angle 110, something like that. I mentioned the lobe centers being a little bit further apart. Hard to see, but you can see that the lobes are not terribly peaky. It doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of lift. And it's not super short duration. So, it's just a cam with big lobe separations. Nothing special. But, memorabilia from back in the day. One of the things he's got in here about the connecting rods. Rod length can change angularity problems with longer stroke engines. In our case, the longer the better. By longer there, he means longer rod, not longer stroke. I've gone through this in my other videos. This is a prime example of mechanic speak. It doesn't make a hill of beans difference. You just go ahead and use the rod that makes it all come together the best. If it's a slightly longer rod that makes it work, great. Just shorter rod, who cares? Doesn't give you angularity problems. Keep that in mind. This is one of the reasons why I don't want to share too much of this book. Some of the reasons he's doing things are mechanic speak related. And it's just like, yeah, you read this and you just realize he was a mechanic. He was not an engineer. He put some stuff together, came up with an idea, got himself some publicity, maybe got himself some business, who knows. Okay, one of the things that's not actually talked about here as far as the heads go, seek out a machine shop and have them fly cut your 1300 heads 065. Basically what you're trying to do is increase the compression, but he never tells you what the compression ratio is. So you're kind of on your own with what he's doing here, but I do know from some of the readings and whatever that I've done through the years, he was trying to go beyond 9-to-1. So with these old-fashioned heads, I think 9-to-1 was something like the Mofoco head that I've got that's got more metal, 3/4 inch reach plugs and whatnot. You might be able to go past 9-to-1, so long as you're willing to run expensive gas. Maybe shoot for maybe 9.5-to-1. All right, over here with the piston, he's talking about, notching and whatnot. And one of the things he doesn't mention is the wrist pin. The pistons sit out at the end and they're going like this, dot, 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 and of course they cause vibration. The heavier the piston, the more vibration they cause. There are uneven accelerations between this pair of pistons and this pair of pistons. Makes the engine want to rock. So if you can lighten the piston assemblies, you can improve the vibration. But he doesn't mention that you can lighten the wrist pins. There are lightweight wrist pins. Maybe they weren't available back then, but you can get lightened wrist pins nowadays. You might not be able to do it with a 77mm piston, but they are out there. Okay, a few final thoughts. Once again, if you read through some of this stuff where he starts talking about spacings of the piston, deck height, whatnot, combustion chambers over here, at no point in any of his writings does he tell you what happens to your compression ratio. So let's take a look at what he says about deck height. The piston must sit 045 to 050 down in the barrel at top dead center. Okay, this is your deck height right there. So you combine that with, 43cc combustion chamber and the displacement, and you end up with the following. Obviously, I got this deck produces these two compression ratios, and you want a higher compression ratio. So if you go to the one that he doesn't recommend, an 040, and one of my recommendations on one of my prior videos was that you want to run a tight deck. So this is my recommendation, and that only gets you to 8.4. So that's really not very much compression. But getting to higher compression when you have a tiny piston like that, limited displacement, and a head like this, when you start trying to take the combustion chamber and push it down this direction, obviously the cylinder is also going to run down this direction as you shove the entire assembly up into the head. And at some point, the fins of the cylinder begin to interfere with the fins of the head, and there's a point at which you, in order to make it work, you have to reduce the finnage. And that's not good because that's going to kill your cooling. So yeah, there are problems. He does mention it up here that there's going to be a problem if you start doing this. There's going to be some clearance issues, and it's mentioned right there. And let's see if I can get the one other little piece that I wanted to talk about, which is about doing 54 miles per gallon. So if you look into the book, and right there he tells you premium fuel, which, as I said before, is a leaded gasoline swill. So leaded gasoline contains tetraethyl lead. Okay, so if you don't know what tetraethyl lead is, it's an additive that they stuff into gasoline. It is tetra is a prefix meaning 4, so you take 4 ethyls, E, and you attach them to a lead molecule. So what we have in modern gasoline is effectively a bunch of loose ethyls. So you've got a bunch of loose ethyls floating around the tank, along with a whole bunch of octanes. Okay, so you got octanes and they're floating around all over the place, along with a bunch of ethyls. What can we do from a volume standpoint is take all these ethyls and shove them into one tetraethyl lead. So the volume that is contained by 4 ethyls is now contained in one of these. So I've done a 4 into 1 volume conversion, which means in the exact same volume that one of these would have taken, I can now cram one of those. So I've effectively increased the power output of each of these by 4x. Okay, assuming these are then not ethyls, but tetraethyls. As a result of this, if you look at your basic gasoline, and we'll call our gasoline 1, we'll call its power equal to 1. If I go up to the tetraethyls by shoving this additive in, which is a pretty dense concentrate right there, my power goes to something higher than 1. And when I stuff the just plain old ethyls in, which don't have the 4 X's in there, my power per unit volume goes down. So tetraethyl lead's up there, and my just plain old ethyls are down here. We'll call these ethyls. When you come back to the book, 54 miles per gallon while running a higher energy density fuel. Again, it's one more reason why that is going to be unattainable nowadays. Just isn't going to work. Man, it's interesting. It's an interesting piece of memorabilia, but it is just way too full of mechanic speak, and there's too many things that make it not doable and functional in today's traffic. This little guy right there, that's just not going to provide you with enough power. So up the size, some of the concepts are valid, like high compression, but yeah. Anyway, I think that's going to end this. I'll do something else later.